Many fantasy worlds, including some very popular ones, very easily fall into a trap of trying to replicate real-world historical and present-day cultures too closely. And I get it, a lot of fiction thrives on familiarity. People like to see something they recognize, tropes they know from other works of fiction, or imagery and names that they heard somewhere. How many settings have an almost verbatim copy of the Roman Empire? Because when you see those Roman attires and hear the names, it gets across the message. This is the old great empire that ruled much of the world. However, it's easy to start overdoing it. One of the settings I always quote as doing it far too much is Warhammer Fantasy. You have just straight up one-to-one copies of Britain, Germany, Russia, Scandinavia, Egypt, China, India. Just look at the shapes of the continents. They are far from the only setting guilty of this. Elder Scrolls, to a slightly lesser degree, has Romans, Vikings, medieval Europeans, although with some parts of the world with far greater uniqueness like Morrowind or Black Marsh. And I can't say I am not guilty of it myself. The original Shewstone was full of it as well, right down to a lot of the continent shapes as well. But with the Shewstone 2.0 project, I decided I had to escape this crutch and innovate something unique while also keeping a certain familiarity. But how do you do that? Early on, while redesigning the world, I decided to not think about real-world continents too much when drawing the map. Let my hand and my imagination guide the shapes to be something we haven't seen on Earth. Because of the very different geography and cosmology, a lot of things could be very different. And I like to think that for the most part we've escaped copying real geography too much, even if Eritrea still looks a little bit like South America by pure accident. And there is a peninsula inspired by Baja California, because I like the shape. But overall, I stepped away from copying those shapes. When the time came to populate the world, drawing out the regions and the zones, I was about to fall into the same trap, just with slightly different shapes. I started looking at places and thinking, oh, this is like Spain, this is like Greece. But I knew I had to escape this, so I looked for something else, something different I could use as themes to build the world on. A large enough set of diverse themes I could attach to these regions to build upon. And because the goal was to build a world for D&D, one of the first things I looked at was something D&D has far too many of, and that is Cleric subclasses or Cleric domains. D&D Cleric subclasses are great for this because there is a lot of them, and because each of them represents a very striking, memorable theme. Even when some of them feel like they're very similar to each other, when you start getting deeper into it, you realize the distinction between similar but separate themes can lend itself to greater world building. One such example is this region of my world, with the two zones I dubbed Sombrus and Morthas. They evolved from the simple codenames of Death and Grave, based on the respective cleric domains. Though both are related to death, they have very strikingly opposite approaches to this. Grave domain clerics are supposed to rebuke the restless dead and maintain the balance between life and death. Death domain clerics are the opposite of that. They summon and control the undead because they often worship gods of undeath and necromancy. And these two countries and their tribes have a common origin, but have diverged centuries ago over this exact problem. Because gods of death on Shewstone are not evil, the people of Morthas were seeking peaceful passage for the dead and putting the undead to rest. Then, however, a man named Velkoth Sombrus decided that controlling the dead gives people too much power that he couldn't resist. When most of Morthas disagreed, he led an alliance of tribes to create an undead army and try to force Morthas to bow to him in life or in death. Though he managed to conquer a large chunk of it, the remaining tribes left and settled in higher-lying areas, while the descendants of Sombrus created their own identity, terrorizing Morthos and Sylvain and Bellicus to this day. They then had a smaller breakaway in Sangral over here, caused by vampires they couldn't control. Look, I'm not saying Morthas is extremely competent at controlling the spread of undeath, but they're the good guys here, and maybe adventurers coming over the Titan Spine Mountains could help them control these antagonistic forces. A place I was starting to develop when looking at the first drafts of the map was what is now dubbed Selenis. In the original Shewstone, I had a place called Heliad in the same general vicinity, with a somewhat similar shape. As you can tell by the old names, it was pretty much mythical Greece. I was almost getting caught in making Selenis the Greek nation again, when I really thought about the theme I assigned to it. The theme was moon, while the sun theme was shifted over to Solaro to the west, which also took some of the original Heliad ideas. But if Selenis isn't Greece anymore, then what is it? If the theme is moon, we have to think of what the moon makes us think about. Well, the moon is often linked to romantic themes, lovers watching the moon together because it's pretty and it's hanging in the sky. And though the moon of Shewstone is slightly different, being black and scarred, there is a slight romantic theme there. Namely, Lunas the Moon King fell in love with Sothis, the first son. He never got to act on it, thinking he'd be unworthy of her because of his origin from the gods of fire and darkness below, until his sister, Nyctis the Night Queen, tricked and defeated Sothis, something from which she didn't wake up to this day. Lunas struck against his sister, but since she was more powerful, she struck him back and left these scars on him. Now we are much later, a lot of mythical story developed since then. It's a story for another day. But the moon of Shewstone is associated with ideas of feeling unworthy of something because of your origin, with unrequited love, with fighting back against the darkness from which you may have come. So the culture of Selenis is built around a lot of the same themes, about acceptance of others, about redemption, about pursuing love in spite of social mores. Plenty of their art and culture is built on these themes. And when it comes to visual style, I also thought, what kind of architecture or dress does moon bring me to? And I thought, there were plenty of moon-worshipping cultures in the real world, especially in the Middle East. And in fiction, the moon gets brought up a lot in association with the elves, moon elves of Forgotten Realms, night elves of Warcraft. So what Selenis ended up with was ashen-skinned surface dark elves who dress like Middle Eastern shepherds. Whatever the exact details are, you can see how these non-traditional themes lend themselves to develop unique ideas that aren't one-to-one copies of the real world, by borrowing still recognizable bits and pieces of real-world cultures, and rearranging them in new ways that align with these alternative themes, sometimes in less than obvious ways. For example, Bellicus and Irenos here, being themed after war and peace, I almost made Bellicus the steppe nomads and Irenos the peaceful shepherds, mirroring a kind of Dothraki-Lazarene relationship from Game of Thrones. Until a friend reviewing the early drafts, not knowing these plans, made a reference to modern American imperialism, and that really struck a chord with me. Bellicus didn't have to be these stereotypical steppe nomads. Though where and when they are still lends itself to a more nomadic lifestyle, they also inherit the American sense of self-righteousness about their conquests. Bellicus doesn't attack other regions because they want to loot and pillage stuff. No. They are bringing the ideas of their tribal democracy to the rest of the world, still languishing in the darkness of despots and kings. Or so they tell themselves, while their shamans burn entire villages to the ground because they have no plan for what they're doing, and someone got trigger happy. You of course don't have to stick to D&D clerical domains. When it came to developing other continents, believe it or not, I ran out of cleric subclasses, including some of my own inventions. So for the continent of Citra, I had to delve into other codenames or themes. So the next class that has way too many subclasses is the Wizard. So much of Citra codenames were based on wizard subclasses, until I ran out of these two and populated the rest of the continent with damage types and elements and similar ideas. And they still lended themselves to original concepts. One example here is Zang, codename after transmutation. The majority of Citra is populated by various goblinoids or orc-related races, called the newborn races, that were banished here after the Titan War. The firstborn races, the humans and elves and dwarves and such, still shun the newborn races for their association with the old gods, even if they don't worship them anymore, or for being quote-unquote ugly. So when the hobgoblins of Zhang developed really focused and world-renowned transmutation techniques, it allowed them to become more independent from trade with the northern continent of Planitia. They no longer had to trade for tin and amber, which are more common in the northern continent, but they could become very self-sufficient. They used what little materials their home island provided them and could suddenly supply much of Citra with much cheaper prices. Zhang quickly became one of the richest places in the world, even if they still got shunned in Planitia and Canaan because the transmuted goods are considered fake, because that would disrupt the artificial scarcity of the established market. You are not even bound to use D&D themes. You would eventually run out of them, of course, and even if I could do paladin subclasses for Erythea or psionic disciplines for Ultima, there were plenty of other themes to expand upon. Erythea became populated with animal themes. Something to remember here is, just because a country or a region has an animal theme, it doesn't mean it has to have animal people there. Felix Islands do, for example, being home to a tabaxi culture that was stuck on their islands for a long time because they were afraid of water, until Nephilim traders from Canaan arrived, gave them ships, and the tabaxi immediately decided to try to find the edge of the world so they could push something off of it. Cat jokes notwithstanding, these don't have to be populated by animal people. They only need to be cultures that embody ideas associated with these animals. And now as I write this, I realize a lot of these regions actually do have animal people to various degrees. But please, just bear with me, okay? Speaking of bears, Ursaid was codenamed Bear, and it has a population of ogres from Citra. Bears are associated with strength, protection, courage, nurturing. These are all things ogres from Ursaid value greatly. And also their legends and culture talks a lot about romantic gay relationships, because bear, ogres, you get it. Wemkor, codenamed Lion, while it does have Wemix, the oft-forgotten lion centaurs of D&D, is supposed to be all about royalty and courage, the ideas we associate with lions. Exiamat, codenamed Horse, has centaurs, but values freedom, power, and speed. And of course there's Vrelas, Korowak, and Erakis, which I talked about in the Arakoa for D&D video, which no one watched, so maybe go watch that. The zones of Flores are named after mythical creatures, not necessarily present there, and Ultima zones are named after plants, fruits, and flowers. And I developed these the least so far, so I won't go into too much detail, but I think you get the idea by now that you can get these themes from anything, and expand on them without copying whole cultures, whole cloth. Just get small bits and pieces from all over the world and remix them into something new, but still familiar to a degree. And I think that is all for today, though, and I hope you enjoyed looking into the details of how I constructed some of the pieces of my newest world-building project, and maybe learned something new from it. What adventures do you imagine having in the places I described today? Are there any other elements of this world, be they specific regions or aspects of general world-building you'd like to hear more about? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe and do all the YouTube stuff. I hope to see you next time if you will enjoy different playable D&D content more than Arakoa. I'll see you there.